ghost story, bringing the spirit home to worship. It was around the beginning of the third watch when the atmosphere was utterly dark and gloomy. It was a night with no moon and very windy. Amidst the murmur of frogs and toads, gusts of wind lashed out, causing the old bamboo grove to bend and scrape against each other, creating an eerie creaking sound. The wooden window, not yet latched, was suddenly blown shut by the wind. Startled by the loud noise, Mrs. Lanh, who was dozing off, suddenly woke up. Her eyes darted around the dimly lit house, her mind hazy and somewhat chaotic. At this hour, almost all the lights in the village of Hoa were off, and the rare flickering light from an oil lamp could be seen somewhere. Turning her eyes to the window frame, everything outside was shrouded in the stillness of the night. Today was the full moon, yet the round moon was obscured by swirling clouds. If it weren't for the occasional barking of dogs and the sporadic cries of birds, one would think this village had no signs of life. Mrs. Lanh sat in a daze for a few minutes, then looked around in bewilderment. Mr. Tu had not yet come home. Her heart suddenly burned with anxiety, an uneasy feeling boiling inside her. Hastily tying up her loose hair, Mrs. Lanh lifted the curtain and slipped on a pair of wooden clogs, heading to the outer room. The dog, then, lying in the corner of the house, lifted its head and wagged its tail a few times in greeting, then curled up and fell back asleep. Mrs. Lanh didn't pay attention to it, rushing to the front door. In the distant fields, occasional flashes of light appeared and then vanished. However, the alley leading to her house was completely dark, and the old banana trees rustled in the wind, but her husband's figure was nowhere to be seen. Every time she felt this kind of fear, Mrs. Lanh would turn to spirituality, hoping that her ancestors would protect Mr. Tu from harm. Mrs. Lanh hurried into the worship room, lit 3 incense sticks, and began to pray earnestly. The incense smoke swirled throughout the cramped room, some of it entering her nose. The soft breathing sounds made the atmosphere even more suffocating. After placing the incense in the burner, Mrs. Lanh sighed and stepped outside. They lived by farming for hire, so despite working hard all year round, the couple had nothing left over. Earlier this year, she was severely ill and had to be hospitalized, so they sold everything of value in the house. The house, usually cramped, now felt strangely empty and spacious. Having endured the most difficult life, the couple cherished their time making money. During the day, Mr. Tu worked as a hired hand on the plantation, and at night he rode his old Honda motorcycle to town for extra work. Mrs. Lanh, after recovering from her illness, could only sell vegetables at the market to help out a little. This afternoon's meal. This afternoon, Mr. Tu hastily ate a bit of pickled vegetables and then drove off. For the past few days, he had been working on something introduced by old Hoa from the neighboring hamlet, often not returning home until almost dawn. Mrs. Lanh was very worried, and each time he did this, she felt extremely anxious. She wanted to advise him, but their only son was about to get married. The bride was from a wealthy family, so as parents, they had to strive even harder. To ensure their son wouldn't be looked down upon when he moved into his wife's family, they painfully mortgaged their ancestral land to get money for the wedding. Fortunately, their son, Phuc, was well-behaved and hardworking, bringing them some comfort. On the day they brought the wedding gifts to the bride's family, although Phuc smiled outwardly, Mr. Tu and Mrs. Lanh knew their son was troubled. That's why they pushed themselves even more, feeling guilty for not providing a better start for him. Even though Phuc promised to repay the money, they didn't want to wait and tried to earn as much as they could in the meantime. After all, the land would eventually belong to Phuc anyway. Mrs. Lanh sat lost in thought, unaware that it had passed midnight. Sleepiness crept over her. Ever since her severe illness, her mental state hadn't been the same. She yawned deeply, causing her eyes to blur, and rubbed them to stay awake. Just as she was about to fall asleep, a familiar light flickered outside. Suddenly, wide awake, she stood up quickly, causing the chair to scrape loudly against the floor. Then, the dog was also awakened and ran outside, following its owner. Before Mrs. Lanh could check if it was her husband, Ven began barking fiercely. Mrs. Lanh stopped in her tracks, startled. Normally, the dog was afraid of her husband and would never bark at him. Unless the person outside wasn't Mr. 2. But who would visit their house this late at night? The night grew colder. The sound of insects chirping filled the air, and Ven's barking was loud in her ears. Mrs. Lanh stood anxiously on the steps, watching the figure come closer. Just when she thought the person would enter the yard, the figure stopped and shone a flashlight towards her. In the dim light, she vaguely saw it was a woman dressed in traditional clothing. It looked like she was pregnant because her belly was very large. Mrs. Lanh was startled, unsure if the visitor was human or a ghost. She thought of the eerie stories she had heard as a child and the village rumors. She wasn't sure what to believe. Spiritual thoughts. Spiritual thoughts kept surfacing in Mrs. Lanh's mind, making her shudder. Hastily wiping the sweat from her temples, she decided to lock the door and go inside. However, just as she turned to go in, a timid yet gentle voice echoed from the alley. "Excuse me, is this the house of Phuc, Nguyen Van Phuc, who studied architecture and graduated last year?" Hearing this, Mrs. Lanh had to stop, as the person the girl mentioned was probably her son. She suspiciously turned back and asked, "This is indeed Phuc's house. But may I ask, who are you? Why are you looking for my son so late at night?" The girl slowly walked into the yard, possibly because her large pregnant belly made her movements slow. One hand supported her back, while the other carried a basket. Seeing this, a dreadful thought flashed in Mrs. Lanh's mind. Could it be that Phuc had made this girl pregnant? As if to answer her question, the girl took off her hat and pulled out a piece of paper from her pocket. After several hesitant moments, she finally bit her lip and spoke. "Hello, I am Ngoc, a friend of Phuc." Ngoc hurriedly handed the paper to Mrs. Lanh, gently patting her belly before continuing. "I am a friend and also the mother of his child. Please don't say anything yet. This is the test result proving the child is Phuc's. I came here today out of desperation. A few months ago, Phuc promised to bring me to meet his family, but then disappeared. I was worried and asked around, eventually finding this place. My belly is getting bigger and the due date is approaching. I couldn't manage alone up there, so I had to come find Phuc. After all, this child is his." In Mrs. Lanh's ears. At that moment, Mrs. Lanh couldn't hear anything but Ngoc's sobbing. She had never learned to read, but now her clouded eyes stared intently at the black and white lines on the paper. The more she looked, the colder she felt. Words caught in her throat, and her heart pounded violently. Her legs almost gave way, but she managed to stay upright. She couldn't believe that her well-behaved son Phuc could do such a thing, get a girl pregnant, and then disappear. She wanted to scold and deny it, but Ngoc had brought documents to prove it. What was she supposed to do? And Mr. 2 wasn't home. Yes, she felt a surge of fear. Thinking of the upcoming wedding, what if old Hoa, their future in-law, found out? The first thing she needed to do was hide this situation and wait for her husband and son to return. With this in mind, Mrs. Lanh forced a smile at Ngoc and said, "What you just said, I don't know if it's true or not. For years, Phuc never mentioned having a girlfriend while he was studying. Now, you come here demanding responsibility, and I don't know what to do." Seeing Ngoc's anxious expression, Mrs. Lanh softened her tone and continued. "Here's what I think. Listen and see if it's acceptable. Phuc's father is working the night shift and hasn't come home yet, and I'm just a housewife and don't know how to handle this. How about you stay here tonight, and tomorrow morning when he's back, we'll discuss and find a solution, giving you a proper answer." Having come this far, Ngoc had no choice but to agree. Her purpose in coming here was to have her child recognized by his family and to secure her own legitimate status, avoiding the stigma of being an unwed mother. After all, this was their blood. Surely they wouldn't be so cruel as to deny it? Ngoc imagined a promising future, but the path ahead was so murky she had no idea what to expect. At this moment, she could only place her trust in this kind woman who might become her mother-in-law. But Mrs. Lanh wasn't concerned with any of this. She hurried ahead, leaving Ngoc to carry her belongings behind. The house was cramped with only 2 bedrooms, one for the couple and one for Phuc. Given the urgency, Mrs. Lanh led Ngoc to her son's room to rest. Inside, there was only a bed and a wardrobe, and the sight of the dusty furniture made Ngoc a bit displeased. Mrs. Lanh noticed Ngoc's displeasure and forced a smile, explaining that the dust was due to the room being unoccupied for a long time. She didn't offer much explanation, and once Ngoc was inside the room, she advised, "Rest and regain your strength. We'll talk properly tomorrow. Also, it's dangerous here at night, so I'll lock the door to prevent any mishaps." With that, she quickly locked the door before Ngoc could react and hurried to the main room. She didn't even sit down, but paced back and forth in front of the door, feeling anxious. Outside, the once hidden moon gradually revealed itself, bathing everything in a pale ivory light. The wind continued to blow, even stronger now, causing the wild grass by the fence to sway left and right. Just as Mrs. Lanh's anticipation peaked, she heard the sound of a motorbike from the end of the alley. The family dog, Ven, lifted its head, then curled up in a deeper corner to sleep. Recognizing that her husband was home, Mrs. Lanh rushed out to meet him. Mr. Tu had just turned off the engine and was about to remove the key when he saw his wife. He frowned and scolded, "It's late at night, and you're out here instead of sleeping. If you catch a cold from the night wind and end up bedridden like earlier this year, who'll take care of you? Phuc and I will have to suffer looking after you again." Mrs. Lanh was used to hearing this. Ignoring her husband's irritation, she grabbed his arm and stammered, "Dear, something big has happened. Phuc! Phuc!" The words stuck in her throat. She knew that if Mr. Tu found out the whole story, Phuc would surely get a severe beating, but she had to say something. Seeing her hesitation, Mr. Tu put the kickstand down and asked sternly, "Tell me, what's the big deal? Why did you stop talking? Did Phuc do something you're reluctant to mention?" Mrs. Lanh nodded, a helpless smile mixed with a hint of resignation on her lips. "Phuc has caused a huge problem. He got a girl pregnant and then disappeared. Now, she's here looking for him. Here, she even brought documents to prove it." Mrs. Lanh quickly handed the crumpled paper to Mr. Tu. In his shock, he took it and scrutinized every word with bloodshot eyes. When he read the line indicating a 99% probability of being the biological father, he couldn't contain his anger any longer. His face turned red with rage, and he pointed a trembling finger at Mrs. Lanh, finally managing to speak. They say a bad son is the mother's fault, and they're right. You've spoiled him too much, and now he's caused this huge mess. A few months ago, he was desperate to marry old Hoa's daughter, and now someone shows up pregnant with his child. Tell me, if old Hoa hears about this, will our son survive? Can we still live in this village? Indeed, everyone in the village knew old Hoa's notorious cruelty. Even those in positions of authority were wary of him, letting his misdeeds slide. For instance, when his youngest son killed someone in a car accident, he faced no consequences, and the victim's family couldn't even press charges, only accepting a small amount of compensation to move on. During Phuc's engagement ceremony, old Hoa had been intimidating, warning everyone. If he found out his daughter had been betrayed, Phuc's life would be in danger, and their family could face severe repercussions. Moreover, Mr. Tu and Mrs. Lanh owed old Hoa a significant amount of money. If he demanded repayment now, even selling their house wouldn't cover it. The more she thought about it, the more panicked Mrs. Lanh became. She paced the yard, muttering to herself, "What to do? What to do? We're doomed, doomed." Unlike his wife's frantic demeanor, Mr. Two, after his initial anger, tried to stay calm and walked over to sit on the steps. After a long silence, he asked, "Didn't you say someone came looking for him? Where is that girl now?" Hearing this, Mrs. Land stopped pacing. She glanced nervously at the dark house and whispered to her husband, "I led her to Phuc's room to rest. I locked the door tightly, so for now, no one will know she's here." Mr. Two nodded absently, lost in thought. His gaze shifted to the room where Ngoc was sleeping, and for a brief moment, a sinister glint appeared in his cloudy eyes, only to vanish almost instantly. It happened so quickly that even Mrs. Land, standing nearby, didn't notice. She was too worried about her son. Despite her anger, Phuc was her flesh and blood. How could she stand by and watch him be tormented by old Hoa? Mrs. Land went inside to pour a cup of tea for Mr. Two. After he took a sip, she cautiously asked, "What should we do now, dear? Phuc's wedding is just a few days away. I'm afraid if we don't handle this, something terrible will happen." Frankly, if forced to choose between Phuc and the unborn child, she would choose her son. She just didn't know how Mr. Two planned to handle everything, especially with the wedding so close. When the wedding arrangements and the tent arrived, Ngoc would surely find out. If she caused a scene, the whole village would know, not just old Hoa. The thought of what old Hoa might do sent chills down Mrs. Land's spine, recalling the grim fates of those who had crossed him before. Mr. Two seemed to understand his wife's fears. The cheap, bitter tea slid down his throat, and he took a few more sips to clear his mind. After a moment, he advised Mrs. Land, "No one can know about this. Tomorrow, go to the market and see if she met anyone when she arrived. I'll call Phuc and tell him to come home so we can get to the bottom of this. In the morning, I'll visit Mr. Tin on urgent business. You stay here and don't let her leave the house." Mrs. Land nodded, trusting Mr. Two's judgment. He had always managed to resolve even the toughest situations. Though she was frightened, his words reassured her. The couple exchanged a brief glance before heading inside and locking the front gate. As the oil lamp flickered out, darkness quickly enveloped everything. In the distance, a rooster's crow signaled the approach of a new day. The night passed quietly. The next morning, Mr. Two woke up early, finished his personal hygiene, and then quickly drove away. Mrs. Land was also awakened by the sound of the engine and stumbled out of bed. Through the old, worn-out window, Mrs. Land caught a glimpse of her husband's silhouette. An urgent need to urinate hit her suddenly, so she hurriedly shuffled out into the backyard. After taking care of her physiological needs, she returned to the house to unlock the room for the girl. Perhaps due to exhaustion from the previous day, Ngoc was still fast asleep. Occasionally, there were soft snores. Seeing all this only added to Mrs. Land's dissatisfaction. But she was certain that Ngoc would never become her daughter-in-law, so she didn't care much. Seeing that time was passing quickly, Mrs. Land quickly ate a bowl of watery porridge, then grabbed her basket and headed to the market. Remembering Mr. Two's instructions from the night before, Mrs. Land followed them exactly. Whether it was vegetables, fish, or meat, she didn't hear anyone ask or mention the girl. Mrs. Land was convinced that her speculations were correct. She bought a few vegetables and a little meat. Then, once her anxiety had passed, she leisurely headed home. Meanwhile, in another village, Mr. Two's Honda was rumbling towards a neat house at the end of the neighborhood. Stopping in front of the tiled courtyard, Mr. Two quickly brushed off the dust from his clothes, then meekly entered the door. Inside the fragrant wooden house, Mr. Tin, with his robust figure, was already seated, enjoying his tea. The scent of lotus tea permeated the air, and as soon as Mr. Two stepped in, he could smell it. He silently rejoiced in the wealth. Even the tea was different from what he normally had. Though he thought of other things, outwardly, Mr. Two showed admiration and flattery. Standing in front of Mr. Tin, Mr. Two deftly pulled out a black pouch from his crossbody bag and handed it to the man sipping tea in front of him. "This is the money the fortune teller gave me last night. Now I'm returning it to you. Please count and see if it's enough. I intended to come here last night, but unfortunately, I had some urgent matters at home that delayed me until now. I hope you understand." Hearing Mr. Two's explanation, Mr. Tin frowned, his face showing a hint of displeasure. "There. If brothers like us talk like that, it damages the relationship a lot. But that bit of money isn't rare for me either. If you're busy, just take care of your business first. Then when you have time, you can bring the money to me." Mr. Two nodded in agreement, but he knew full well how greedy and stingy Mr. Tin was. Not long ago, the guy who ran errands for Mr. Tin dropped tens of dollars and got beaten and chased away, even earning the reputation of a thief. Just like now, speaking about morality and righteousness, yet Mr. Tin's hands kept counting money incessantly, his eyes bulging as if afraid of losing something precious. Anyone in this village knew that Mr. Tin liked to put on a show. The more righteous he seemed outside, the more corrupt he was inside. Seeing Mr. Tin finished counting the money, Mr. Two immediately poured tea and flattered him. "I know you're a good person, but when it comes to money, I have to be fair and keep my word to do business in the long run. Last night, I made 2 trips, gathering all those things from 2 clinics before daring to bring them to that teacher. He warned that in the near future, he might need more goods. The price doesn't matter. What's important is to supply enough for him." Mr. Two fell silent after saying that. Mr. Tin also remained pensive for a few seconds, but quickly smiled. "Money can buy even fairies. Just do your job well. Don't worry about these things. Making money isn't hard, but not everyone has the guts to do it. I admire your courage more than the young people these days." The reason Mr. Tin praised Mr. Two so much was because Mr. Two's nightly job was quite special. The goods they mentioned weren't something anyone dared to look at, let alone hold, let alone gather enough to deliver at midnight. Initially, when Mr. Two took on this job, he hesitated a lot, not because he was afraid, but because he had never seen this type of business in his entire life. But once he started, he realized that anything could make money in this world. It's just a matter of daring to do it. Mr. Two chuckled along with Mr. Tin. "You're right. I've lived to this age, and I'm not afraid of anything. I'm not even afraid of ghosts and demons, let alone those unborn kids." Before Mr. Two finished speaking, Mr. Tin solemnly interjected. "Well, what you're saying is wrong. Anything related to the spiritual realm must be believed. Haven't you seen how my life has improved since I worshipped it? Before that, I was no different from you, just a poor guy." As Mr. Tin spoke, his gaze suddenly turned towards the ancestral altar. Apart from the pictures of the ancestors, there was also a table below it. On that table sat a black doll with strange patterns on it. Around it were many cakes, incense smoke thick in the air. Just looking at it, one could tell how much the homeowner cherished that doll. Initially, when Mr. Two saw this scene, he found it strange, but later he learned that the thing was called the Golden Boy. It was a doll made from a fetus's body, with the function of making its owner wealthy. It was said that Mr. Tin's sudden rise in wealth was also thanks to it, so now he doted on that doll more than his own flesh and blood. Recently, as life developed, the demand for spiritual needs also rose, especially in the matter of nurturing the Golden Boy. Mr. Two contemplated. Before, when he delivered the goods to the master, he inadvertently saw many wealthy people begging just to buy a doll. At first, Mr. Two didn't believe it much, but gradually he felt shaken, sometimes even thinking about whether his life would change if he also raised one. Seeing Mr. Tin getting richer, Mr. Two felt envy and longing. As if seeing the desire in Mr. Two's eyes, Mr. Tin suddenly smirked. "Or maybe you should raise one too. Who knows, it might bring you fortune. With money and talent, build a house to enjoy old age, because I don't think Phuc will be of any help. Knowing this, but dreams and reality are different. Right now, he didn't even have enough money to feed himself properly, let alone to raise such a thing. Mr. Tu pondered for a moment, then shook his head with a sigh. Forget it, sir. I'm struggling day and night just to have enough to eat, let alone think about buying this thing for worship. It's not cheap either. Mr. Tin nodded. What you're saying is true. A few million is little to me, but too much for you. How about I lend you the money to buy it, and you can pay me back gradually as labor? But I think you'll regret spending the money. If you already have that thing, it's better. Just take it to the master to refine. For some reason, after hearing Mr. Tin speak, Mr. Tu suddenly remembered the young woman who had visited his house last night. Rumor had it that she was already 8 or 9 months pregnant, but because it was late last night, Mr. Tin hadn't had a chance to see her. If only? Several thoughts crossed Mr. Tu's mind, but they came and went so quickly that he couldn't grasp them. Reflecting on the mischiefs caused by Phuc, Mr. Tu wanted to laugh, but found no joy in it. The wedding day was approaching, and now another pregnant woman had appeared in the house. If Mr. Tin found out, the outcome would be as disastrous as it could be. Seeing Mr. Tu's despondency, Mr. Tin thought he was worried about something. Taking a sip of his tea, Mr. Tin glanced sideways, his tone tinged with mockery. I'm telling you, to achieve great things, you must have courage. If you fear the unknown, you'll end up like those timid, poor folks. As Mr. Tin put Mr. Tu's hard-earned money on the table, he stood up and leisurely walked towards the altar. His corpulent body trembled with each step. Upon reaching the altar, Mr. Tin lit incense and muttered something, looking very devout. Meanwhile, Mr. Tu sat there, clutching the money tightly in his thin hands. Hearing that disdainful tone, Mr. Tu felt a surge of anger, but redirected his gaze towards the doll enjoying the offerings. He silently swore that one day he would surpass Mr. Tin. The conversation ended on a sour note. Mr. Tu drove his old dilapidated motorbike back home. Passing through the familiar streets, the old, worn-out house of the couple gradually came into view. At this moment, Mr. Tu noticed a car parked in front of the yard. Without needing to guess, he knew it was Phuc returning. Unlike other times of joy, he only felt extreme indignation in his heart. Parking the bike in the yard, Mr. Tu locked it and went straight into the house. But inside was a scene of utter chaos. Broken furniture scattered around, Phuc cursing with wide eyes, while Mrs. Lanh sat on a stool helplessly watching the scene. Normally, although Mr. Tu's figure was very lean, his voice was extremely serious when he spoke. Phuc, what have you done? Still causing trouble? Do you want the neighbors to ridicule us because of your misbehavior? Only now did Phuc step back in fear, knowing how terrifying his biological father could be when angry. Last night, when he received Mr. Tu's phone call, his first instinct was to flee, but now, after causing this commotion, he had nowhere to go. So, he hurried back to resolve the situation. And all of this mess was caused by that wretched boy. He had been advised to have an abortion, but he concealed it. Thinking so, Phuc's malicious gaze turned towards Ngoc. As Ngoc stood timidly at the doorway, she couldn't believe Phuc's frightening reaction. At that moment, she wondered if coming here was the right decision. While Ngoc was wiping her tears, Mr. Tu walked in and calmly said, "You're Ngoc, right? Since you've come to my house, I'll be straightforward with you. Phuc is about to get married." Mr. Tu looked towards the room and seeing Ngoc's startled face continued, "My family only accepts you as the daughter-in-law. Your appearance is unexpected. Last night, I questioned Phuc about the situation. Initially, they were together, but when Phuc found out about the pregnancy, he offered money for an abortion. But you silently let it grow, so my family cannot bear responsibility for it. Now, my wife and I have discussed it. We will gather some money for you to give birth. If you're worried about the child suffering later, let this old couple take care of it." As for you, I'm sorry. I cannot accept you as a daughter-in-law." Ngoc was almost stunned. Every word Mr. Tu said felt like a hammer hitting her head. She couldn't believe it. Her hand pointing to her stomach, tremblingly said, "I am carrying your family's flesh and blood. How can you refuse to accept me as your daughter-in-law? My child, my burden, how can I bear to part with it?" At that moment, Mrs. Lanh frowned. "If you're afraid for its suffering, you can give it to us. I don't have just one grandchild. My future daughter-in-law is also pregnant." Mrs. Lan's words dashed Ngoc's hopes, choking back the words she intended to say. Thinking about her child growing up without a father, Ngoc couldn't help but cry. She had thought that bearing Phuc's child would change his mind, but she never expected to face this situation. Thinking about Phuc and the other woman being happy, Ngoc felt an unbearable sense of jealousy. The terrifying jealousy of women is well known. Just thinking about it made Ngoc's chest surge with invisible anger. She glanced around the house, then smiled and said, "My child must have both parents. You said Phuc is getting married? Fine. If you three don't resolve this properly, I'll stay here. I'll wait until the wedding day and then reveal everything to the other family. Let's see who wins, who loses." After speaking, Ngoc didn't care about their reaction and slammed the door shut behind her. Phuc, seeing this, wanted to rush in and break the door down, cursing, "Your cursed mother! Open the door! Do you believe I can break in there and kill you? You want to ruin my life, don't you? You cursed child! Open the door!" Mr. Tu glanced at Phuc, then slammed his hand on the table. "Disrespectful! Ungrateful brat! Your mother and I raised you, fed you, educated you, and this is how you repay us? You dare to curse again? Sit down here now." Scolded by Mr. Tu, Phuc fearfully shut his mouth and slowly walked over to sit down on a chair. He hadn't expected things to escalate like this. He regretted not taking the time to take the woman for an abortion earlier. Unlike Phuc's thoughts, Mr. Tu focused on Ngoc's pregnant belly. Remembering Ngoc's words, he recalled what Mr. Tin had said. If you want to accomplish something big, you need courage. But courage for what? The wedding was approaching, and letting this situation drag on wouldn't be good. What if someone found out? There would be no way to salvage the situation then. Each person lost in their own thoughts. The space became silent, the atmosphere somewhat stifling. Finally, Mrs. Lanh timidly broke the silence. "What should we do now? The comedy stage is being set up in a few days. By then, everyone will know." Mrs. Lanh hesitated, but Mr. Tu understood her meaning. After a struggle of thoughts, Mr. Tu looked at Phuc and asked, "Does Ngoc have any relatives in the city?" Phuc shook his head after hearing this. In all the time they had been together, he had never seen Ngoc's relatives visit. Besides, she was an orphan, which was why he initially got involved with her. No family ties meant no complications. He could easily walk away whenever he wanted without anyone chasing him down to scold or curse him. "She's an orphan, working in the town," he said. Mr. Tu, having already guessed as much, turned to Mrs. Lanh and asked, "So, what about this morning when I asked you to inquire?" Mrs. Lanh, not forgetting her task, approached Mr. Tu and whispered for both of them to hear. "I went to listen around, and no one in this village knows she came looking for Phuc's house. It was late at night, so who would be awake to know?" After all the discussion, Mr. Tu became even more determined in his thoughts. Just as Mr. Tin had said, people wouldn't hesitate to ruin others for their own sake. If he had given her a way out initially and she didn't take it, then it wasn't his fault. If she wanted to ruin the wedding, let her. If the secret couldn't be kept, then so be it. Only the dead can keep a secret, and then Mr. and Mrs. Tu could sleep peacefully. Mrs. Lanh, seeing Mr. Tu's expression changing, asked hesitantly, "So, how are we going to resolve this in the end?" Mr. Tu smiled, his forehead wrinkling. He looked towards the door and said gently, "If we want Phuc to live in peace, the best way is to shut her up, specifically." Mr. Tu made a cutting motion across his throat. Mrs. Lan and Phuc shuddered at the sight, but Phuc accepted it quickly, leaving only Mrs. Lan trembling. She was scared indeed, very scared. She couldn't believe her husband would suggest something so cruel. Seeing Mrs. Lan turn pale and then green, Mr. Tu scolded her. "What are you afraid of? If we want to live, we have to deal with her. Can't you see she's not saying anything? If you don't act now, who knows when this will all be over? Or do you want to wait until Hoa finds out and kills us all?" After the wave of fear subsided, Mrs. Lan finally calmed down a bit, though her heart was still pounding. Though she was afraid of killing someone, the thought of her own death made her shudder uncontrollably. After all, who wants to die? Even the severely ill seek a way to live. Mrs. Lan's eyes became resolute as she glanced at the room, a hint of cruelty flickering in them. She quickly got up to light incense at the altar, bowed a few times, then returned to her seat. Mr. Tu understood Mrs. Lan's intention and took out a small wrapped package from his bag. He instructed, "When you cook dinner for her tonight, put this in. After she drinks it, Phuc and I will take care of everything smoothly. As for you, after finishing, go back to your soon-to-be wife. Remember, only the three of us know about this. No one has come to our house, and no girl is in there. Got it? Keep this secret to yourself forever." Mrs. Lan and Phuc, though frightened, nodded vigorously. At this moment, both of them had no choice but to trust Mr. Tu completely. They hoped that everything would go smoothly and without any trouble. Holding the paper package tightly, Mrs. Lan only prayed for that much. Time passed slowly, and as the sun set behind the mountains, the dark night quickly replaced it. It was a moonlit night in the village of Anh, with the full moon illuminating everything, making the once sturdy houses look even more desolate. Along the village roads, trees stood silently under the moonlight, occasionally accompanied by the sounds of insects echoing from the dense bushes. It was past 11 o'clock, while the people of An Hoa village were all deep in their dreams. On the path leading to the quiet river, two figures hurriedly appeared. They were none other than Mr. Tu and his three relatives, with Phuc carrying something on his back. As Mr. Tu was very familiar with this path, he walked ahead with the dim flashlight in his hand shining straight ahead. Perhaps this path was rarely traversed, as the grass grew thick, and there were even a few thorns scratching at Mr. Tu's ankles. Phuc followed behind, complaining about the strong, pungent smell. "Father, are we almost there? This smell is making me nauseous." Mr. Tu proceeded cautiously, listening to Phuc's words, then stopped and shone the flashlight on him. Indeed, Phuc's black shirt was covered in blood, but luckily, Mr. Tu had managed to erase all traces along the way. The flashlight once again illuminated the face of the girl. Phuc was indeed carrying Ngoc. After being given an abortion pill by Mr. Tu and Mrs. Lan, Ngoc's health had become fragile like a candle in the wind. With her mouth tightly bound and limbs bound tightly, Ngoc could only glare at them with resentment in her eyes. Seeing this, Mr. Tu smiled, a very mocking smile. "I gave you a choice at first, but you refused to listen. So this is the consequence. But rest assured, when you descend into the abyss, our child will be well taken care of." At the mention of the child, Ngoc struggled violently, but her efforts were futile in Phuc's eyes. "Humph, it's all your fault. I told you it was just a fling, but you insisted on keeping the child to ruin my life. You deserve to die." As they walked and talked, they didn't realize when the father and son had arrived at the riverbank. Phuc, seeing they had reached their destination, released Ngoc, letting her fall onto the damp ground. Mr. Tu ordered him to remove the ropes. With her limbs freed, Ngoc struggled to crawl, but her efforts were futile. Mr. Tu and Phuc pushed Ngoc straight into the flowing river. This river was deep, its current swift, making it uncertain even for a grown man to swim across. So, at this moment, Ngoc was no different from a stone thrown to the riverbed. After a few struggles, Ngoc gradually sank down. She wanted to scream for help desperately, but the icy water denied her the chance. It's unclear what Mr. Toot had given Ngoc, but her body lacked strength, her limbs trembling, her whole being in agony. Especially when the child slipped out from her womb, Ngoc wanted to hold on to it desperately, but she could only watch her child die. At that moment, Ngoc truly regretted for believing in the sweet, coaxing words of Mrs. Lanh. Regretted for carrying her belly to find Phuc. But now it was too late. The relentless current seemed to plunge straight into Ngoc's nostrils and mouth. She couldn't scream, couldn't shout. In the pitch-dark night, she could only despair and be engulfed. Splash! Splash! As Ngoc disappeared beneath the river's surface, white foam bubbled up. Mr. Toot and Phuc stood motionless, only exhaling when the water settled. Mr. Toot swiftly took out some gasoline, then instructed Phuc, "Quick, take off your shirt and throw it here." While speaking, Mr. Toot also removed the ropes that had bound and gagged Ngoc, bundling them together. Then he poured gasoline over the bundle, lit a match, and tossed it in. The flames flared up brightly for a moment, but were extinguished in a matter of minutes, as if nothing had happened. Mr. Toot dumped the ashes into the river, surveying the area to ensure all traces were erased, then smiled. Seeing this, Phuc shivered, feeling an inexplicable chill despite his usual fear of his father. Mr. Toot paid no mind to his son's gaze. His only desire at that moment was to return home and witness the demise of the baby with his own eyes. In stark contrast to Mr. Toot's anticipation, Mrs. Lanh was consumed by fear. The cramped house was filled with the pungent smell of fresh blood. Bloodstains extended from the bedroom to the main hall, as Ngoc screamed shortly after ingesting the drugged food. Before Mrs. Lanh could react, Mr. Toot and Phuc barged into the room, gagging and binding her. Too terrified to enter, Mrs. Lanh could only watch from outside, peeking through a thin, fluttering curtain. She witnessed the horrific sight of Ngoc's lower body soaked in blood, something resembling flesh mixed with fresh blood oozing out slowly. There were no screams, no cries, only the sound of labored, exhausted breathing. The air was suffocating, making Mrs. Lanh feel nauseous even after drinking a bitter cup of tea. After Mr. Toot and Phuc finished, they dragged Ngoc outside the door. Then the three of them carried her away. They left Mrs. Lanh alone, strictly forbidding anyone from entering or touching anything in the room. Mr. Toot reiterated his instructions several times, and Mrs. Lanh nodded vigorously, overwhelmed by fear. By now it was well past midnight, and everything outside was shrouded in silence. Even the owls in the corner seemed to sense something amiss, occasionally emitting uncomfortable hoots. As time passed, Mrs. Lanh's anxiety grew like a raging fire. She couldn't sit still, pacing back and forth, partly feeling guilty and partly worrying about her husband and son. Mrs. Lanh's footsteps came to a halt, and somehow she found herself standing in front of the room's door. Her cloudy eyes slowly peered inside, and upon seeing the entire scene, she was horrified. On the bed, a newborn lay still, wrapped in blankets, the umbilical cord dangling. Mrs. Lanh knew that Mr. Toot intended to send Ngoc to the afterlife, but witnessing this scene frightened her too much. Just as she stood there dismayed, a cold hand suddenly tapped her lightly. Perhaps due to being too focused, she jerked in surprise. At that moment, Mr. Toot's voice echoed, "What are you doing standing here? Didn't I tell you to go back to the bedroom?" Hearing her husband's voice, Mrs. Lanh breathed a sigh of relief, and in response to Mr. Toot's questioning, she stammered, I was just curious. I've been waiting for you for so long, so I wanted to come over here and see if there was anything that needed to be tidied up." Mr. Toot frowned. What's there to be curious about? If you can't help, then go back to the bedroom instead of standing here and getting in the way. Women. With that, Mr. Toot strode straight into Phuc's room and promptly closed the door with a firm thud. Mrs. Lanh seemed accustomed to this reaction, so she just grabbed Phuc's hand. "Phuc, tell me, why did your father leave the child there? Why didn't he take it with him to Ngoc?" Mrs. Lanh started, her voice filled with concern. Phuc seemed a bit bewildered for a moment, then looked at Mrs. Lanh, scratching his head with a chuckle. Why do parents care about such things? If Dad wants to keep the kid, let him. Mom knows his temperament from before. Anything that happens, Dad never thinks it through. The important thing is that the trouble has been resolved. Now I just need to hold my head up and wait for the wedding day. Phuc's words were true. The wedding was just a few days away. With Ngoc's matter settled, Mrs. Lanh should have felt relieved. But for some reason, she felt incredibly heavy-hearted since seeing that thing. She didn't know whether it was right or wrong to feel that way. Watching Phuc's figure retreat behind the well for a bath, Mrs. Lanh reluctantly returned to her room. Sitting on the mat, she couldn't seem to close her eyes. Looking through the old window, she suddenly spotted a dark shadow perched on the jackfruit tree in the backyard. It seemed to be some kind of bird, so she paid it no mind. Resting her hand on her forehead, lost in thought, she eventually drifted off to sleep without realizing it. Outside, on the aging jackfruit tree, a crow from the dark forest stood motionless. Its emerald eyes fixed on the house of Mr. and Mrs. Lanh, and after a few minutes, it let out a mournful cry. The sound was like a lamentation, filled with anger, and shortly after, the crow flapped its wings and flew away. It came and went like the wind, with no one knowing or caring. As for the appearance of the crow in the backyard, those in the house were completely unaware. Mrs. Lanh thought she wouldn't be able to sleep after that bloody night, but unexpectedly, she slept soundly. It was just in the strange dreams that occasionally she heard the sound of a hoe hitting the ground. It echoed for a moment, then quickly faded away. In the following days, Mrs. Lanh lived in constant unease and anxiety. Every time someone came to the house, her face turned pale, and sometimes she couldn't even stand. But Mr. Tu was different from her. He carried on with his activities as if nothing had happened. After that night, when Mrs. Lanh woke up, the house had been cleaned. Even the smell of blood had disappeared, and the dead child seemed to have never existed. If she hadn't seen Ngoc with her own eyes, Mrs. Lanh would have thought she had never been there. Since that day, whenever she stood in the house, she felt as if someone was watching her, and that gaze was very cold, making her skin crawl. And every time she mentioned it to her husband, Mr. Tu sternly reprimanded her and repeatedly warned her never to mention it again. Time passed quickly. It felt like just yesterday that Phuc's wedding day was approaching. That day, even though it was only 7 o'clock, the cramped house of Mr. Tu and Mrs. Lanh was bustling with excitement. The men sat drinking and entertaining guests, while the women gathered in the makeshift kitchen to cook. Because in the past, when Mrs. Lanh was healthy, she always came to help whenever there was a feast, so this time everyone came to help her. Mr. Tu wore a brand new suit prepared by Phuc, and Mrs. Lanh wore an elegant velvet ao dai. Seeing the usually impoverished and humble elderly couple now looking so elegant made everyone admire them. When Mr. Tu went to serve the wine, everyone praised him, making him secretly pleased. And Mrs. Lanh was also admired by many women, her desire for fame and prestige rising. In just a moment, she suddenly had the thought that it would be nice to become wealthy. Despite trying to hide many thoughts in her mind, Mrs. Lanh dared not delay in preparing for her son's wedding. Mrs. Lanh was busy all morning, attending to every detail, and if anything wasn't to her liking, she insisted on redoing it. Time flew by quickly, and by noon, Mrs. Lanh couldn't hold back any longer due to a sudden urge to urinate. She whispered to the sisters beside her before hastily retreating to the back garden. The urge caused her stomach to ache, and she quickly pulled down the white silk pants and sat under a tree. While relieving herself, she suddenly noticed a mound of dirt protruding near the vegetable patch, with a hose stuck in it. It must have been dug up just 3 or 4 days ago because she had been out here picking vegetables before and hadn't seen anything. Lost in thought, she suddenly remembered the missing child from the previous night. And after pulling up her pants, she slowly made her way towards the mound of dirt. Mrs. Land's footsteps were light and silent, not making a sound, and as she got closer, she held her breath. Just as Mrs. Land focused, somewhere in the garden, a cry of lamentation echoed. "Oh!" The sound was prolonged and somewhat echoed, turning the empty garden into what seemed like a tightly sealed box. Mrs. Land stood frozen in place, her legs stiff and unable to move. Then, in front of her, where the mound of dirt lay still, the ground suddenly shifted. Before Mrs. Land could understand what was happening, a dirty hand emerged, followed by a head and finally a small figure. Witnessing this scene, Mrs. Land felt even more frightened. The child in front of her was none other than Ngoc. Covered in blood, with eyes still shut and no signs of life, it slowly crawled towards her. "Grandma! Grandma!" the eerie child suddenly exclaimed, its once innocent voice now strangely hoarse. With every move, it left behind a trail of blood. Seeing it getting closer, Mrs. Land panicked and shouted, "I'm not your grandma. I don't have a grandchild like you." The child seemed not to understand what Mrs. Land was saying. A few seconds later, its dirty, outstretched hand grabbed Mrs. Land's white silk pants, smudging dirt all over them. The child looked up at Mrs. Land, its mouth forming an eerie smile. "Grandma, I miss you so much." No, it's not true. I'm not." Mrs. Land shook her head in panic, muttering incessantly. But the child seemed oblivious, grabbing her leg and slowly standing up. A chilling sensation engulfed her limbs, rendering Mrs. Land unable to move. Then, in a moment of terror, the eerie child climbed onto her in an unusual manner. In an instant, its tiny body was facing Mrs. Land's pale face. It wrapped its arms tightly around Mrs. Land's head, the coldness and foul odor piercing her nostrils. Mrs. Land felt the resentment in its eyes, its teeth gently grinding. You're the one who hurt my mother. Your whole family hurt me." "No, it's not true." Mrs. Land wanted to deny it, but now her mouth was sealed shut. She could hear the sounds of conversation and clinking dishes from the front of the house, Mr. Tu entertaining guests. Yet, she couldn't cry for help. Her throat choked up, unable to form words. And the child, who spared her no mercy, whom she had seen toothless that day but now possessed sharp teeth, suddenly giggled and bit fiercely into her gaunt face. Mrs. Land felt herself collapsing backward, her head hitting the ground hard, sending her into a daze. Her vision blurred, her breath weakening, the pain on her flesh becoming numb. And yet, the child continued to crawl upon her, like a predator watching its prey fall into despair. It kept laughing and saying, "Go to hell! Go to hell!" Those words sounded like a curse in Mrs. Land's ears. She wanted to exert all her strength to crawl forward, but her whole body felt weighed down by a heavy stone. After several failed attempts, Mrs. Land finally gave up. The uncertainty of life and death threw her mind into turmoil. In this moment, she wanted to unload all her guilt onto her husband and son. Then she surrendered, her white silk pants now stained with mud. Gazing at the clear blue sky before her, Mrs. Land silently wondered if she had reached her limit. Perhaps today was the day Mrs. Land had to die? Had to die at the hands of demons? But before she could find an answer to this question, she felt a strong force pushing her. In her ears, she faintly heard Mr. Tu's voice. "Mrs. Land, can you hear me? Wake up quickly. Why are you lying here like this? The bride's family is about to arrive." Suddenly, she regained consciousness from her hazy mind. Mrs. Land realized she was lying on the ground, and Mr. Tu quickly helped her sit up. Mrs. Land hurriedly touched her face, but there were no traces of anything. The white silk pants that should have been stained with blood and mud were now only slightly dirty, as if nothing had happened. Mrs. Land grabbed her husband's hand, her face pale, and asked, "Honey, did you see anything when you came here?" It was on me." Mr. Two was puzzled when he heard this, but shook his head. "What do you mean by it? I heard Mrs. Tam say you were in the bathroom for a long time, so I came out to find you. Unexpectedly, I saw you lying on the ground, eyes closed tightly, even your limbs trembling." At that time, Mr. Two thought Mrs. Lan was feeling dizzy, so he didn't pay much attention. But now, looking at her expression, Mr. Two felt strange. However, Mrs. Lan didn't hear any of those words. She quickly pulled up her pants, and where there should have been scratches, now there was nothing, as smooth as ever. Could it be that everything was just her imagination? But the feeling at that moment was so real, it couldn't be fake. Mrs. Lan swallowed hard, her eyes scanning the garden. Her voice trembled. "Darling, when I went to the bathroom earlier, I saw something else. That child, the one we killed that night?" At this point, Mrs. Lan fell silent. Hearing the faint mention of the child, Mr. Two could guess somewhat. A strange expression briefly appeared on his face, but quickly disappeared. Mr. Two turned to look into his wife's eyes, then suddenly spoke. "Don't speak nonsense. What if someone else hears? I've told you how many times. This matter must never be mentioned again. Even if it means death, it must be taken to the grave. Why do you always forget? Or do you want our whole family to die together to be satisfied?" Seeing her husband's disappointed expression, Mrs. Lan could only force a bitter smile. She didn't want to bring it up either, but the feeling at that moment was so real. Even now, she still felt pain on her skin. Yet Mr. Two didn't see anyone, nor did he see any scratches on her. So, were the things that happened just now a product of her exhausted mind or something else? After a while, Mrs. Lan was still lost in chaotic thoughts, where the line between reality and dreams was very thin, making it impossible for one to discern. Mr. Two noticed that his wife was slightly more awake and reminded her to tidy up her clothes before hastily helping her into the house. As the figures of the two disappeared from the desolate forest, laughter suddenly echoed under the dirt mound. In a moment, it was mixed with the cries of children, then screams of indignation. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through, causing the trees in the garden to shake violently. Even the old jackfruit tree emitted a chilling creak. But when fireworks were set off in front of the house, everything strange suddenly stopped, as if nothing had happened. Yet, no one knew about what happened behind the garden. Phuc's wedding went smoothly, and throughout the entire process his mouth never stopped smiling. Even Mr. Two, who usually had a stern face, couldn't close his mouth. Because the bride's family was wealthy, Mr. Two and Mrs. Lan didn't dare to do anything that might be seen as disrespectful. The offerings and feasts were all grand and festive. However, in the scene that was supposed to be joyful, Mrs. Lan couldn't muster a smile. Her face struggled to show happiness, but more than that, it displayed confusion and bewilderment. Despite Mr. Two's repeated nudges and reminders, Mrs. Lan returned to her initial state after just a few minutes. In the end, the wedding proceeded smoothly, which relieved Mrs. Lan. Meanwhile, Mr. Two secretly rejoiced because the debt might not need to be repaid anymore. After the wedding, Mrs. Lan's daughter-in-law insisted on not staying in the cramped house. As a mother-in-law, Mrs. Lan wanted to show understanding, but she felt upset inside. Mrs. Lan and Mr. Two only had Phuc as their son, and naturally, they wanted him to live with them for ancestor worship. However, this daughter-in-law named Yen was so disobedient. Although outwardly Mrs. Lan nodded in agreement, her attitude revealed dissatisfaction. As for Yen, she didn't care either, exchanging a few greetings before quickly dragging Phuc away. Watching the car gradually disappear, Mrs. Lan glanced at Mr. Two and sighed with frustration. "Look at that, what a pity! We only have one son, and now he's following his wife. We thought we could rely on him. But who would have thought? I don't even know if he'll come back to take care of us when we're sick in the future." And the incense of our ancestors, who said marrying a rich wife was fortunate. Mr. Tertu was now drunk and staggered as he observed the deserted wedding stage with not a soul in sight. Suddenly, his slurred voice rang out. "I told you, you're foolish. What's not to like about marrying a rich wife? She's happy, so we're happy too. Its roots are here, so no matter where it goes, it must return here. As for taking care of me and you, that's the duty of a child. Is it disobedient? And it will be quick. Me and you won't have to suffer like this anymore." With that said, Mr. Tu stood up unsteadily and stumbled into the bedroom. Mrs. Lan didn't bother to follow, but went to find a broom to clean up. The wedding stage, which was set up just a few days ago, was now slowly being cleared. The bustling atmosphere was replaced by the clattering of objects. When she was left alone in the spacious courtyard, a sense of fear crept into Mrs. Lan's mind. The sky was beginning to darken, and the rustling sound from the trees seemed louder. Hastily putting away the items in her hands and hurrying inside the house, Mrs. Lan lit a lamp and slowly entered the room. There, Mr. Tu was still immersed in a deep sleep, with a smile on his lips as if dreaming of something beautiful. The old, faulty window was suddenly struck by a gust of wind, making Mrs. Lan startle. She quickly went to latch the door, and then sat on the bed, whispering to herself, "Is everything really okay, or is it just the beginning?" Mrs. Lan wondered to herself, but there was no one to answer. She should have felt that this was the end of it, yet for some reason, there was an unusual restlessness in her heart. Mrs. Lan had a feeling that something big was about to happen, and the big event that Mrs. Lan sensed happened soon after. It was a gloomy day with drizzling rain. As usual, Mrs. Lan prepared food for Mr. Tu and carried vegetables to the market to sell. With her son's wedding over, she had to help her husband earn money to repay debts and redeem the piece of land they pawned. The road to the market was slippery today, and Mrs. Lan nearly stumbled several times. Because nothing strange had happened in the past few days, Mrs. Lan was alert and back to normal. With a smile on her lips, Mrs. Lan carried the vegetables to her usual spot. The mix of smells, both foul and fragrant, wafted into her nose. It seemed so familiar to her now that she calmly arranged the vegetables she had cut earlier in the morning. Sitting with her chin resting on her hand under the temporary shelter to avoid the rain, Mrs. Lan occasionally called out to passers-by to buy her vegetables. Some came to support her, while others brought idle gossip about Phuc's wife's family. In moments like these, Mrs. Lan just smiled and nodded. Outside, dark clouds covered the sky, and the drizzle intermittently stopped and started again, catching people off guard and leaving them slightly damp. The bustling scene of sunny days had been replaced by a sense of gloominess. Looking at her still full pile of vegetables, Mrs. Lan sighed and thought she might have to go home early today due to poor sales. Just as she was about to tidy up, a woman selling fish hurriedly ran in from outside. Before her agile figure could reach the spot, her loud voice rang out. "Oh my goodness, have you heard the news? They found a dead body by the riverside. Hurry, go take a look. It's a young girl, not from our village." This shocking news caused a stir and whispers in the market. A plump woman spoke up quickly. "What? How dreadful. No one has drowned in our village for years. Why now? Are you sure the person isn't from here?" Another woman interjected. "No, surely not. This village is as small as a nostril. If someone goes missing, we know right away. How could a body suddenly show up in the middle of the river?" Some people asked more detailed questions. Whose daughter is it? How did she drown in our village? Was it suicide or murder? Oh my, I have to go outside and see for myself. Every word of the gossip was clearly heard by Mrs. Lan, causing the bundle of vegetables in her hand to fall to the ground. Despite the reminders from those around her, she stood still, her face pale with shock. Only when someone gave her a strong pat on the shoulder did Mrs. Lan bend down to pick up the bundle of vegetables. The women selling goods in that area all followed one after another towards the riverside, and Mrs. Lanh was no exception. Along that short path, a terrifying thought lingered in her mind. The person whose body had been found, perhaps it was Ngoc, the young woman who had been harmed at her house that night. Quickly, everyone had reached the riverside, and by now, the villagers had gathered tightly. From a distance, Mrs. Lanh could see the thick incense smoke rising, and the murmurs of horror continued unabated. "Oh my, even an old woman like me dare not look straight at it. It's so terrifying, so eerie. I heard that girl was very young. To die at this age is very ominous. Quickly, tell the young folks to stay away. Amitabha Buddha, Amitabha Buddha." The closer Mrs. Lanh got, the heavier her footsteps became. She didn't need to look to know who it was. With a sense of trepidation, she squeezed her way into the crowd, and when she witnessed the body, her heart pounded heavily in her chest. The girl's body had been laid out on a mat, surrounded by incense sticks. Everyone wore solemn expressions. If it had been a villager who died, they would know how to handle it. But here was a stranger, and there was no identification found on the body. Proving her identity now would be difficult, and if the police were called to investigate, the body would decay. Just as the drizzle stopped, a gust of cold wind swept in. One would think the wind couldn't do much, but suddenly, a corner of the shroud was flipped over. The terrifying face of the girl gradually emerged before hundreds of curious eyes. The corpse itself was already frightening, yet somehow, this girl's eyes were wide open, unable to close. Normally, after being submerged in the river for so long, a human body would be completely devoured by fish. But this corpse was still intact. Its pallid flesh was bloated, perhaps from ingesting too much water, making it appear as if she were pregnant. This is an unjust death. There must be a great grudge for her not to be able to close her eyes. Surely this girl died in agony, which is why she's like this. Amidst the tense atmosphere, a hoarse voice suddenly echoed. It was an elderly woman from the village who, upon seeing the drowning victim, shook her head continuously. Some people believed her, while others remained skeptical, but the suffocating atmosphere remained unchanged. Mrs. Lanh stood among the crowd, her body shivering with cold as the rain soaked her clothes. Upon closer inspection, one could notice her trembling hands and feet, her face pallid. Upon learning that the body was Ngoc's, her unease grew even stronger. Especially when she accidentally looked into those lifeless white eyes, a chill ran down her spine, and she felt as though Ngoc was staring right at her. Her chest felt constricted, making it hard to breathe. She remembered the night when Phuc and Mr. carried Ngoc outside. She thought they were taking her far away. But she never imagined they would dump her into the river, only to be discovered days later. Thinking it best to return home to avoid anyone noticing her strange expression, just as Mrs. Lanh was about to turn away, she suddenly found the men carrying Ngoc's body passing by her. Normally, 4 people could carry the body, but now it required 7 or 8. Still in shock, Mrs. Lanh hadn't fully regained her senses when the piece of wood supporting Ngoc's body suddenly slipped and fell. Bitch! Mrs. Lanh barely had time to hear a loud noise in her ear before Ngoc's body rolled to her feet. This time, those terrifying eyes truly stared straight at her. Trembling, Mrs. Lanh took a few steps back, yet at this moment, blood gushed from the eyes and mouth of the corpse, staining Mrs. Lanh's pants even though she had retreated. The corpse's hand slammed down on Mrs. Lanh's foot, almost grabbing it. Facing this scene, Mrs. Lanh's legs and arms felt weak. Luckily, someone nearby caught her in time. The men quickly placed Ngoc's body on the wood and continued forward. When their figures disappeared, the crowd slowly dispersed. Mrs. Lanh, as if in a daze, went back to the market to clean up, then somehow made her way home. Despite her bundle of vegetables lying scattered on the steps, Mrs. Lanh trembled as she sat at the table, taking a sip of water. In her mind, there were only images of Ngoc's lifeless body. Then, Mrs. Lan found herself holding her head, murmuring endlessly. "She's seeking revenge. She's here for revenge. No, no. She's here to kill me. She wants to kill her husband." While Mrs. Lan was in turmoil, suddenly a breeze swept through Phuc's house. The thin curtain fluttered, revealing a terrifying face, a pale shadow on the bed. If his family saw it, they would surely recognize it as Ngoc. But Thuy Tich had no chance to discover this, as he was currently driving into the mountains to find a renowned sorcerer. Rumored to be highly skilled, he had saved up money to seek his help. With a black bag by his side containing the child Ngoc had been carrying and was killed for. Wealth and fame were desirable, especially for someone who had lived a hard life like him. With nothing to lose, he had to take the risk. With many worries, he arrived at the sorcerer's house, finally reaching his destination after many rough roads. Parking in front of a gloomy house, Thuy Tich removed his helmet and glanced inside. Nestled in a desolate forest, he thought it would be a very dark place. Yet, it was just a very ordinary house, except for the many strawberry bushes outside the fence. Taking a deep breath, he hurried inside. Standing in the overgrown courtyard, he called out, "Is anyone home? I was referred here by Mr. Tin for some urgent matters." His voice echoed into the house, but there was no response. The eerie silence was unsettling. Just as Thuy Tich was becoming impatient, a figure slowly emerged from the door. The person appeared to be over 50, with graying hair. Seeing Thuy Tich, the sorcerer raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Tin called me this morning. Have you brought what's needed? Because I'm quite busy and cannot afford any failure." Thuy Tich nodded hastily. He quickly pulled out a black pouch from his bag and handed it to the sorcerer. Opening the pouch and examining its contents, the sorcerer's bloodshot eyes narrowed. "What is this child to you?" Mr. Tu jerked his head up, recalling the instructions given by Mr. Tin, then clenched his teeth and confessed, "Yes, this is my granddaughter. She passed away just a few days ago." Mr. Tu expected the sorcerer to inquire further upon hearing his words. But to his surprise, the sorcerer merely glanced at him with deep, penetrating eyes and nodded in acknowledgement. The child's corpse, now decomposed and emitting a foul odor, had skin that had decayed and been washed away in places. When it was first unearthed, Mr. Tu had almost vomited. Mr. Tin had spoken highly of this sorcerer's skills, and even the doll he was raising at home had been blessed by him. If it were anyone else, Mr. Tu would have been skeptical, but seeing Mr. Tin's sudden wealth, he had no reason to doubt further. The sorcerer had now entered the house, making a subtle gesture inviting Mr. Tu to sit on a chair. As he stepped inside, Mr. Malnif Tu shivered at the cold and gloomy atmosphere. In the center stood an altar, worshipping deities Mr. Tu had never seen before. Below it sat a strange black doll, adorned with vivid red patterns. Unlike Mr. Tin's offerings of fruits and sweets, Mr. Tu noticed a glass filled with a bright red liquid. The longer he gazed into the doll's eyes, the more powerless he felt. Then, suddenly, the sorcerer's voice rang out in his ear. "Don't mess around." With that, the sorcerer glanced at Mr. Ma Tu and calmly said, "Please wait here for me. It might take a while, so you can go into that room to rest. But absolutely do not look at that altar. The thing on the altar will tease you if I'm not around." As soon as the sorcerer finished speaking, the doll chuckled in a spine-chilling manner. Strangely, Mr. Tu's previously weakened body now felt strong again. Hearing the eerie sound, Mr. Tu immediately bowed his head, staring at the ground. He was surprised because this doll was completely different from the one Mr. Tin raised. It could even laugh menacingly. He had heard of sorcerers using Kumathong dolls to manipulate them to kill their enemies. The stronger the sorcerer's power, the more potent the doll. Mr. Tu dared not stay there any longer. He quickly entered the nearest room to find peace. The sorcerer waited for Mr. Tu to leave and approached the altar. grabbing the knife and swiftly slicing into his fingertip. Fresh blood dripped into the red glass, causing the doll to convulse violently with each drop. After a few minutes, it returned to normal, and the sorcerer took Mr. Two's child into another room. Time passed quickly, from early morning to late evening. Mr. Two hadn't expected the doll-making process to take this long. Glancing at the wall clock, he worried that Mrs. Lan at home would be anxious. Just as Mr. Two was losing patience, the sorcerer finally appeared at the door of the room, holding a black doll that looked duller than the one outside. Mr. Two felt a surge of excitement. Finally, he had his golden boy. Surely, his life would change, and wealth and fame would come his way. After placing the doll in a wooden box inscribed with runes, Mr. Two calmly drove home. Once his silhouette disappeared, the sorcerer entered the house. A faint voice echoed from the altar. "The child has passed. Bringing it home now is like inviting disaster. No, its purpose is revenge." The man showed no reaction to this. After lighting some incense, he chuckled and said, "I only handle the money. The rest doesn't concern me. Whether they live or die is up to fate. It has nothing to do with me." With that, the sorcerer disappeared inside. A chilling laughter, like that of a child, echoed as the doors of the wooden house slowly closed shut. 3 hours later, when Mr. Two returned home, it was nearly 9 p.m. Finding his house still dark, he assumed Mrs. Lan had gone to bed early. Parking outside, he entered quietly, searching for a match to light the oil lamp. As the light spread, he noticed Mrs. Lan sitting silently on a wooden chair, disheveled and unkempt. Startled, Mr. Two grabbed her shoulders, nearly losing his balance. Anger flared, and he shouted in frustration. "Goodness gracious, why on earth are you sitting here in the dark in the dead of night instead of sleeping? The lamps are out, and you're sitting here like this. Are you trying to scare me to death?" Normally, when scolded like this by Mr. Two, Mrs. Lan would hurriedly explain. However, today she just stared at her husband for a moment, then glanced briefly at the empty room, occasionally smiling in a chilling manner. Mr. Hap-Tu sensed something odd and reached for the wooden box containing the doll, intending to grab Mrs. Lan. But she, surprisingly agile for her thin frame, leaped from her chair. The wooden chair scraped against the floor loudly, and Vienne, the dog, suddenly began barking furiously from the dark corner, its brown eyes fixed on something. Mrs. Lan, too, pointed a trembling finger towards that spot, then abruptly recoiled behind Mr. Two's back. In a panicked whisper, she murmured into her husband's ear, She's here to seek revenge. Oh, she's standing in Phuc's room. No, I saw her body by the riverbank. Blood, so much blood." She trailed off, her body jerking as she darted into a dark corner. This time, she pointed frantically at the cluttered wooden table. "No, not just her. There's also the infant with the umbilical cord uncut. Both mother and child want to kill our family, you, my son. Both of them must run away." At this point, Mr. Two couldn't bear to hear anymore. Somehow, Mrs. Lan's actions seemed so real, as if there truly was a girl in the house. Part of him feared someone passing by might overhear, so he quickly covered his wife's mouth with his hand. Despite Mrs. Lan's violent struggles, she couldn't break free as Mr. Two dragged her into the room and bolted the door shut. Earlier tonight, passing by the village head's house, he had seen villagers and police gathered there. Estimating the time, Mr. Two knew something had happened. Undoubtedly, the girl's body must have surfaced from the riverbed. Yet, strangely, he felt no fear of being discovered by others. Because the medication Mr. Two gave Ngoc was just a common abortion pill, even if she had a miscarriage, it wouldn't reveal much more. Moreover, Mr. Two had already inquired through Phuc about their affairs, and though the two slept together, they didn't spend the day in the same place, so hardly anyone knew about their secret relationship. With all these factors in mind, Mr. Two was even more confident in disposing of Ngoc by drowning her in the river. All his plans seemed flawless, but there was one flaw: Mrs. Lanh. He had always thought his wife was just an ordinary coward, but now she seemed even more feeble. Just seeing Ngoc's body being pulled out of the water made her act like a madwoman, muttering threats. If they were alone in the house, it would have been better, but if someone else was present, Mr. Tu's actions would surely be discovered. Mr. Tu's deep-set eyes looked at his wife, with whom he had spent decades. After much hesitation, he finally decided to confine Mrs. Lanh to this cramped room. As long as she didn't step outside, no one would discover anything. Boarding up the windows, Mr. Tu somehow found a length of chain to bind Mrs. Lanh's legs. But she seemed indifferent, her lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. Her usual tidy appearance had now been replaced by disarray and dirt, alternating between fits of laughter and tears. Seeing this, Mr. Tu decisively locked the door, took a deep breath, and stepped out of that dark place. Slowly, he took the doll out of the wooden box, placed it on the altar, and lit a candle. The excitement in his heart surged. Just thinking about his future wealth, like Lao Tin, made Mr. Tu ecstatic to the point of trembling. Indeed, raising the golden boy had furthered Mr. Tu's endeavors. If initially he had relied on Lao Tin, now he could venture out on his own. Dealing in aborted fetuses brought him a fortune and even earned him some reputation among the sorcerer community. After paying off Lao Tin, he no longer had to look at their faces to live. The man named Tu had completely changed. Clad in expensive clothes, every time Mr. Tu walked out, he held his head high, not looking at anyone. As for Phuc, he enjoyed his father's money. If before he pretended to be a good person, now his true unruly and wicked nature was fully revealed. But now he was unafraid because his father was wealthy, a man of means. Their lives then were pure enjoyment. Only Mrs. Lanh, Mr. Tu's wife, lay seriously ill in bed, unable to see anyone. On the day of the housewarming party for the new luxurious house, Mr. Tu organized a grand ceremony, inviting only the wealthy. He basked in their flattery and support, puffing up with pride. Inside the fragrant teakwood pillars, the ancestral altar had disappeared, replaced only by a shrine for the Kumathong doll. It was laden with all kinds of food, from pork to chicken to duck, leaving everyone impressed and envious. Night fell quickly over the village of Anhoa, dispersing the lively daytime atmosphere. Strangely, it began to rain heavily, with lightning streaking across the sky, illuminating the entire area. In stark contrast to Mr. Tu's newly furnished home, the nearby old, dilapidated house lay silent and forsaken in the dark night. The leaking roof had soaked the interior, drenching the floor. Mrs. Lanh, tied to the bedpost, had her hair dampened by the rain. Once with a hint of flesh, she was now emaciated, her neck and face scratched, her nails caked with dirt, incessantly clawing at herself. A bowl of rotten food lay before her, insects crawling in. This was Mrs. Lanh's current existence, her sanity long gone. The son she had lovingly raised had never visited her. Boom, boom, boom. Outside, thunder and lightning continued incessantly. Inside the foul-smelling room, the deafening sound pounded on her head. Mrs. Lanh, stuffing moldy rice into her mouth, suddenly froze. She jumped up and approached the tightly boarded window, her face filled with joy as if she had seen something. Even Vienne, the dog, barked loudly. Mrs. Lanh abruptly banged her head against the closed window, blood streaming down her forehead, yet her lifeless eyes remained fixed outside, murmuring incessantly, "She's here! She's here! Her child is here too! Death, we're all going to die! It's over! It's over!" Amidst the rain, a long flash of lightning streaked across the sky. Outside the window, shrouded in darkness, a figure appeared. A girl with a pale face, sunken black eyes devoid of pupils, blood oozing from the corners of her eyes and mouth. She wore a soaked white ao dai, bare feet sinking into the muddy ground. Most notably, she held a black doll in her arms. Upon closer inspection, it resembled the golden boy worshipped in Mr. Tu's house. The night passed swiftly. The rain outside not only persisted but grew heavier, accompanied by an unexpected chill in the air. Mr. Tu, as usual, went to light the incense for the doll shrine in his house. However, after lighting it, he noticed several wet footprints on the tiled floor. Upon closer inspection, he realized they belonged to a girl, and strangely, they led to where the doll sat. Worried about theft, Mr. Tu quickly checked around the house but found everything valuable intact. The more he thought about it, the more puzzled he became. With many perplexing thoughts in mind, Mr. Tu, out of habit, went to the kitchen to get leftovers for Mrs. Lanh. As he stepped through the dilapidated door, a foul stench assaulted his nostrils, making him gag. Rushing to the old room to feed Mrs. Lanh, he was stunned by what he saw when the door opened. The woman, who had seemed insane just the day before, now lay lifeless on the floor, blood pooling around her head. Mr. Tu dared not breathe heavily as he approached, his trembling hand touching her nose. It seemed she was dead. Mr. Tu's feeling at that moment was not sorrow but rather jubilation. Since the discovery of Ngoc's body, after countless autopsies, it was finally ruled a suicide. The villagers had collected money to buy her a coffin and buried her in the cemetery. With Mrs. Lanh's death, she was the only one who could reveal this secret. Yet now, she was dead, unexpectedly so. Mr. Tu withdrew his hand, tucking it into his pocket, then smiled. Good riddance. This is good indeed. Without further ado, Mr. Tu returned to his luxurious home. He called Phuc to inform him of Mrs. Lanh's death. Initially surprised, Phuc quickly regained composure. After arranging matters, he returned to the village to organize Mrs. Lanh's funeral. Mr. Tu organized a grand funeral for Mrs. Lanh. Those who had done business with him attended, expressing condolences. The death came as a shock. Villagers had thought Mrs. Lanh was ill, but not to this extent. Mrs. Lanh's coffin was placed in the spacious house, surrounded by burning incense and offerings. Her portrait was meticulously made, resembling her when she was alive. Mr. Tu and Phuc stood on either side, wearing mourning clothes, their faces showing grief, as if she were someone very dear. Only the daughter-in-law was absent, claiming pregnancy prevented her from attending a recently deceased person's place, much to Mr. Tu's dissatisfaction. If not for her father-in-law's wealth, he would have instructed Phuc to divorce her immediately. During the day, Mr. Tu and his companions put on a show of wealth and affluence, but at night they paid little attention to Mrs. Lanh's shrine. Once the guests had left, Mr. Tu revealed his true self, and Phuc quickly emptied the donation box to count the money. The two of them eagerly counted the coins, praising those who gave generously and sneering at those who gave little. Unbeknownst to them, the doll shrine above was staring directly at them, its red lips curling into a strange smile, its head turning incessantly. Mr. Tu felt someone watching him as he counted the money, but when he looked around the house, he found nothing. Thinking he was just tired, Mr. Tu's movements became faster as he wanted to rest. Meanwhile, Phuc, feeling thirsty, went to pour himself a cup of tea. As the bittersweet tea flowed down his throat, he sighed with satisfaction. Suddenly, Phuc's eyes inadvertently glanced towards the courtyard, where a familiar figure stood. Despite the darkness, he could clearly see the familiar face. The tea slipped from Phuc's hand, shattering into pieces on the ground. Sweat poured down his forehead, his limbs stiff and immovable. Slowly turning his head towards Mr. Tu, Phuc's eyes were vacant as he said, "Father, I saw her! She's standing in our courtyard." Hearing this, Mr. Tu's hand froze, and he turned to look at the courtyard, but there was no one there. Only trees and the pitch-black night surrounded them. Mr. Tu furrowed his brows, looking at Phuc and asking, "Who? Are you out of your mind? There's no one outside." But Phuc shook his head, rambling nonsensically, "It's Ngoc! It's Ngoc! She's come to find us!" Seeing his son's behavior, Mr. Tu was reminded of his deceased wife, Mrs. Lanh, who had also exhibited similar symptoms. Horrified, Mr. Tu quickly stood up and struck Phuc on the head. "Wake up! Wake up! Are you going crazy? Snap out of it quickly. Stop talking nonsense. Perhaps it was because Mr. Two's blows were so strong that Phuc quickly regained consciousness. He hugged his head in confusion, looking at Mr. Two. "Father, why did you hit me?" Upon hearing his son's question, Mr. Two suddenly realized that something strange was happening. Could it be the vengeful spirit of Ngoc seeking revenge on his family? The more he thought about it, the more horrified Mr. Two became. He hurried to the shrine and lit incense, murmuring prayers. "My child, please protect us and keep us safe. Don't let evil spirits harm us." Finishing his prayers, Mr. Two lit the incense and turned to Phuc calmly, saying, "After her funeral, you should quickly return home to your wife. It's not good to stay here too long." Mr. Two only said that to get Phuc out of there. He actually wanted Phuc to invite a spiritual healer to perform an exorcism. Ever since Phuc started acting strangely, Mr. Two felt like someone was watching him. And if he let his guard down, something big would definitely happen. He only hoped that the Golden Boy could protect his family so that his efforts wouldn't be in vain. Late at night, when Mr. Two and Phuc were fast asleep, the motionless doll on the shrine crawled out and, like a puppet, entered the room of the other family. It stood at the door, laughing sinisterly. A voice filled with hatred echoed, "Grandfather, father, you must die, you must die." Balan's funeral lasted for 3 days. On the day her coffin was taken for burial, it rained heavily, making it difficult for everyone to lower it into the grave. Even Phuc couldn't help but mutter curses under his breath. Mr. Two became even more impatient, wanting to quickly finish the proceedings to deal with matters at home. Despite some trouble, they finally laid Balan to rest peacefully in the tomb. After everything was sorted out, darkness began to fall outside. Perhaps sensing something amiss, Phuc asked Mr. Two for permission to return home with his wife. Mr. Two also wanted that, so he hurriedly sent Phuc away. As he watched the disappearing car in the darkness, he looked around the house and thought to himself, "Even if the living are killed by me, what can the dead do?" The end.